So welcome everybody to this meeting of the Republican Labour Education Forum. I think we're all still reeling from the results of the US election, and we're very delighted to have with us today Luke Pickrell, who is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America and editor of the Democratic Constitution blog, and fighting for a republic in a republic. Even more so, I would imagine, from now on, Luke. So I'm not going to say any more, but hand straight over to Luke to talk about the fallout from the US election.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Carol and Steve and everyone for having me here. It's very nice to talk with you all, and I'm excited to have this conversation. It's been an opportunity for me to gather my thoughts, read some of what other folks are saying, think about, I think, what I can add to the conversation that maybe isn't getting talked about too much, which is what I'd really like to do. I'd like to try and add some new things to the conversation. So I think to start off, acknowledging that one way of answering the question of what the elections mean for the US, England, and the rest of the UK, one way to do that would be to focus on policy speculations. So, questions of what does a Trump victory mean for the economy, both in the US and perhaps in other countries, foreign policy, climate crisis, immigration is certainly a big one, so on and so forth. Also asking that question of what a Trump administration is likely to do in those regards that maybe a Harris administration would not have done, and vice versa. What can the Republicans do now that they have the presidency? They have a majority in the Senate. I think they're very close to getting majority in the House. Uh, they have most of the Supreme Court picks as well. And then one could also ask, I suppose, how will the Labor Party work with Trump? What will go on? And I think that's usually where the conversation goes after the results are known. What can we expect? How can we prepare? So on and so forth. They're all very valid questions. But I'm here and very excited to talk about the elections from a Democratic Republican perspective. And how I'm framing that is the perspective of someone who's very much struggling and involved with people who are struggling for a democratic constitution in the US based on unicameralism and universal and equal rights. So, what I'm going to be exploring is what's the state of that democratic Republican movement in the US, and then how will a Trump victory impact that movement? How has the recent Trump victory impacted that movement? Those are really the questions that I'm going to focus on in my little introduction here. So, the first thing I want to do is talk about how I'm defining democracy, which I think is something that's rarely done. I think it's very important to do. And you'll notice that I'll use the term democracy, democratic state, and also democratic republic interchangeably. And I'm wanting to explore what is this thing that the US working class doesn't have, that the US doesn't have, but that it needs. So when I talk about democracy, I make a point of reserving the word for a specific political structure. And I draw a lot on Victor Berger, who was a congressman and a member of the Socialist Party of America in the early 20th century. And I draw from him in saying that a state can be called democratic when all legislative power is vested in a single legislative body. So Victor Berger argued for legislative power being placed in the House of Representatives in the case of the US, and that the enactments of that body, though subject to referendum, would be the supreme law. And that is to say that no other branch of government could veto or invalidate them. And I'll get into why that's an important point in the US context in a little while. And then I also draw from the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the RSDLP, the organization that Lenin was involved in, and then also the American Democrat Tom Paine, who It's funny, I call him American Democrat. He wasn't born in the US, but he very much influenced the United States. Um, and from them, I get that idea that there's a single legislative body and that body has to be elected by universal and equal suffrage, and that citizens need to have universal and equal rights. So those are ideas that are floating around in my head when I'm talking about this thing that I'm calling a democratic republic. And because I have that perspective, when I'm talking about the US, I'm saying that, okay, the US could be called a democracy if those things existed, but they don't. And so the US can't be called a democracy. And from that position, other positions follow, one of which is my argument that there are no real degrees of democracy in the US, that we weren't more of a democracy under Biden and actually won't be less of a democracy under Trump, that there's no such thing as a bourgeois democracy, perhaps where one group of people has this thing called bourgeois democracy, and perhaps the capitalist class uses democracy or bourgeois democracy to kind of hoodwink the working class and keep them from fighting for socialism. Instead, I'm reserving the term democracy for something that does not yet exist. And so how I think it's helpful to define the US or to think about the US is as a constitutional republic with varying degrees of freedom versus authoritarianism. So, for example, in the US, there could have been more freedom, there was more freedom under a system of Jim Crow than under slavery. But then with the civil rights and the voting rights laws of the 1960s, well, that freedom was expanded compared to what existed under Jim Crow. So, given everything that Trump has said on the campaign trail, I expect that we'll see a restriction of domestic freedom under the Trump administration. But again, I'm reserving the term democracy for a particular type of state. I would argue that we're not going to be seeing a restriction of democracy or a rolling back of democracy, because I'm using that term for something that we still need to win. And then just to say that, of course, within that future democratic state that I'm talking about, there will, of course, be problems that will come up, I'm sure, but at least there will be institutional mechanisms that will allow us to address those problems. And a big issue that we're facing in the US is that we have all kinds of problems, but there aren't institutional mechanisms through which those problems can be resolved. And that brings me then to our Constitution, why there aren't mechanisms that can allow us to resolve those problems. So I'm assuming that folks are sort of familiar with the US Constitution and its oddities. I don't really want to do a whole rundown of the Constitution, but those oddities that we should have in mind, the most relevant being that we have a very powerful president, especially because of the veto power that our president has. There we have a severely malapportioned Senate, because each state gets 2 senators regardless of the state's population. And there's a formal minority veto or a filibuster within that Senate. We have an unelected federal judiciary, and those members serve life terms, and the Supreme Court, the 9 Supreme Court justices, they have the power of judicial review. And the cherry on top, so to speak, is that our amending clause to our Constitution, Article 5, is widely considered very hard to use, if not at this point unusable for all intents and purposes. And I point those out to say that those are the hardwired parts of our Constitution. And hardwired is a term that the University of Texas political scientist Sanford Levinson used in a book at least 20 or so years ago. And I think it's important to talk about hardwired parts of the Constitution because presidents come and go, right? We have a new president now. Amendments to the Constitution pass. or as I like to point out in the case of the U.S., they rarely ever do pass. But these hardwired parts say the same. This is like the core essence, if you will, I think, of our Constitution. So the question then being, why? Why do we have a Constitution like this? And just to briefly say that I think it's helpful to see the Constitution as a class-based document that was designed to frustrate and deny majority rule. Its creators, the creators of the Constitution, also called the framers, they feared rule by the many. They feared democracy just as much, maybe more, maybe just as much, I don't know, as they feared the rise of a new king, a rule by one. I think the important point, though, is that fear of democracy and the fear of a unicameral system where there is power in the hands of the people, so to speak. And I like this quote by a lawyer and author Ian Forgey. And Ian explains that the framers designed the Constitution to obstruct the exercise of majoritarian rule, which they feared would result in the erosion of the privilege of landholders, a deterioration of the racial caste system, and the redistribution of wealth. And then I like how he describes how the system usually works. While the people may elect the House on broadly democratic lines, the House, the lower part of our legislative system, can do nothing without the Senate's approval. If something offensive to elite interests should sneak past the Senate, the president can and frequently does veto things. And then if by some miracle, as Ian puts it, a bill would evade the president, well, then we have the courts, especially the Supreme Court, that can come in and veto that opportunity. So you have a system of checks and balances, to use a term that everyone likes to use, and a lot of people like to use it very endearingly. But it usually is checks and balances on the majority will. So I include here a few statistics to emphasize how egregiously the Constitution violates this principle of universal and equal rights and creates what an increasing number of people in the US are referring to as a tyranny of the minority. That's a whole other thing, I suppose, of all the new phrases that you have folks saying in regards to the Constitution, how it freezes things or locks things up, or it creates a tyranny of a majority, or it's a bind. Someone I'm sure could write an interesting paper on all the different words that are being used to describe what's going on. They're often very negative, restrictive words. So a few statistics here. So before 2000, the Electoral College had overturned the popular vote for president only 3 times. So that being that the winner of the popular vote lost the election because their opponent got more Electoral College votes from the states. So that happened 3 times before 2000, but it's happened twice since November of 2000 when George Bush won the election. It happened in 2016 as well with Trump, and then it nearly happened a 3rd time in 2020. I don't remember the numbers exactly off my head, but Biden won the popular vote by, 3 or 4 million votes or whatnot, but came within 500 or so votes, 500 or so thousand votes of losing a particular swing state. And if they had lost 7 million, that's far more millions. They came close to actually losing a swing state, which could have thrown the election. The Senate is only growing more imbalanced. I mentioned how the Senate works. Thanks to equal state representation, there are actually folks predicting that by 2040, that 70% of Americans will be represented by just 30 senators, and that the remaining 70 senators will represent the other 30% of the population. One interesting thing I've noticed, you'll see people post a map, perhaps, of the U.S. elections, and it looks very red. It is very red. Most of that map is red. And people will say, well, this kind of definitively proves that most people in the US want Donald Trump to be president. And just one observation about that is that it doesn't take into account where most people live in the United States. I mean, just because most of the map is red, for example, doesn't mean it doesn't take into account that in very small blue sections, for example, Los Angeles, California, New York, uh, that's where most of the people in the U.S. live. Just a small thing I've been noticing. So often, what can happen in our Senate system is that a party representing a minority of the population will actually win a majority of Senate seats. So, for example, in 2016, the Republicans won a 52-seat majority, but the senators that they had, those 52 senators, actually only represented 45% of Americans. And then in 2018, the Republicans won a 53 seat majority, but again, those folks actually only represented 48% of Americans. So you have these strange situations, and it's perhaps needless to say that this doesn't get remarked on in the media. You just hear the results of people winning elections, and whether or not that majority is representative of a actual majority of Americans is rarely ever questioned. So of the few countries, I'm continuing here with a few of these statistics, of the few countries with a bicameral legislative system and a malapportioned upper house like ours, only the US, as far as I'm aware of, has a Senate or an upper house with a veto. And for us, that's the filibuster, which can be made from 41 senators, again, thanks to that malapportionment, representing as little as 11% of the country in total. And this situation in which every bill basically needs 60 votes to pass automatically, this creates a weird situation in which bills will lose 54 votes to 39. You know, they didn't get 60. So it's sort of an automatic filibustering, if you will. And that 54 to 39 was the vote on a recent bill to expand access to in vitro fertilization, which has majority support in the US, but it loses because it receives 54 votes for, but that's not 60. So that's a loss. Police reform, every time there's a high profile police killing, these days there's actually a particular bill that's touted out there. That bill has never managed to get through the Senate. Gun control, it's the same thing. Climate change action, it's the same thing. Bernie Sanders and also Joe Biden were talking a lot about the Green New Deal. That was blocked by two Democratic senators, really, and it emerged from our legislative meat grinder, as some folks say, as something very distorted from what it originally was. Federal judges, right, which include our Supreme Court justices, as I said, they're unelected. They serve life terms. The Supreme Court basically gave itself judicial review in the very early 19th century, allowing it to look back and review constitutionality of various decisions. Something that people have been commenting on only within the past few years. It really is one of these stats where you see one person say it and they're the first, and then all of a sudden everyone is saying it, is that 5 of our 6 conservative justices, and there is a 6-3 conservative justice majority, 5 of those 6 justices were nominated by presidents who lost the popular vote. George W. Bush and Donald Trump. And then 4 of those 5 justices were confirmed by a majority of senators, a 51 majority vote of senators, who represented a minority of the population, right? The 51 senators who voted for these folks, well, if you take the populations of their states that they represent less than 50% of the US population. And then given that folks serve life terms, and given that, for example, Clarence Thomas is the oldest member of the court and he's 76, you can expect, you could have expected a right-wing judicial dictatorship, if you will, to continue into the mid-30s. Now that Trump is president again, he'll probably have a chance to nominate more folks, and so that power will likely last even longer. It's worth mentioning, too, I think, that the individual bias of justices is becoming more glaring. So Justice Thomas, who was one of these justices who was confirmed by a majority representing a minority, it's widely known that he's received millions of dollars in luxury travel. Samuel Alito, another justice, flew a flag in front of his house connected to the idea that the 2020 elections were stolen. There's nothing to do. There's nothing that can be done. And one of the reasons that there's nothing that can be done to get rid of these justices, and really nothing that can be done to get rid of a president, is because it's so hard to kick someone out of office through the impeachment clause, which is also in our Constitution, which requires a very onerous 2/3 vote in the Senate after a simple majority vote in the House. No justice has ever been impeached, and no president has ever been convicted of impeachment. You need to be impeached and then convicted. No justice has ever been impeached. That's the first step. No president has ever been convicted after they've been impeached. And then last but not least, constitutional reform through Article 5 is very, very onerous. And so you can essentially say there is no way to create constitutional change through the rules of the Constitution. So having reviewed some of the political system, I'd argue the core of the political system that we're working with here, I want to turn to the critique of that system. Are people talking about it? What are they saying? And then how might Trump's victory impact that discussion that we're having about these things? So the first thing to say about constitutional critique is that the U.S. had a relatively mainstream, vibrant, if you will, tradition of constitutional critique, up until about the 1930s. People really have critiqued our Constitution as deficient, undemocratic, violating universal and equal rights since it was ratified. And that critique was probably the strongest, as I said, from the end of the Civil War period to about the start of World War II. The Socialist Party of America called for a democratic republic in most of its presidential campaign programs. It was a strong critique. But what we've seen is that critique tends to come in waves. And we're really only now just emerging from a very long lull, if you will. And a book came out recently in the States by a law professor at Boston College, Aziz Rana, published a book called The Constitutional Bind. And that book, I think, breaks a lot of ground in terms of tracing really 100-year marooning of that critique of the Constitution. And Aziz Rana points to causes related to World War II, war, Cold War, and just kind of the general disaster that was the 20th century. For various reasons, it was hard to critique the Constitution during that period. There is, though, a renewed focus on the Constitution in the States, and I think that appears in two distinct areas. The first is a critique taking place in academia, usually colleges, and some sections of the media. And what's interesting to note is that in some ways, this sphere of critique is ahead of what the socialist left has provided. So one very small way to judge that is just to look at all the articles the New York Times has published about the Constitution. It's not a ton, but it's more than, for example, Jacobin. Jacobin magazine has published about the Constitution in about, I don't know, the past 15 or so months. Some people in this media academia group, including folks like Aziz Rana, another author and academic, Robert Ovitz, Daniel Lazaire, a longtime journalist, they're politically far to the left and have always held critical views of the Constitution. and they're much more ideologically distinct, I think, from those who work in similar professions. But others within this media academic camp, for example, Harvard professors Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky, and most recently, within the past month or so, the head of the University of California, Berkeley's School of Law, very prestigious law school here in the States, Edwin Chemerinsky, they've changed their minds about the Constitution over about a 5 or 6 year period. Still, I think they see a new constitution as more of a technical fix, if you will, to America's woes, rather than a means through which one could see a more significant transformation of America and through that the world. It's interesting to examine how some there can be constitutional critiques, but all constitutional critiques are not the same, and how they differ. Hardcore defenders of the Constitution certainly remain, but what I like to point out is that there's definitely something in the water, if you will. I think that's a good phrase to use, something in the water. Even some supporters of the Constitution, including former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, have hesitated, given the opportunity, have hesitated to launch full-throated endorsements of the Constitution. So Nancy Pelosi actually responded to Aziz Rana in the New York Times talking about the Constitution. And as Aziz Rana pointed out, she didn't launch a full-throated defense of the Constitution. Basically what she did, and this is what other folks do too, is to say, yeah, there are problems, but it's nothing that the rules of the existing Constitution can't fix. And also, thank goodness we have the Democratic Party, because once we get into power, we're going to pass legislation that change these things. Now, that was about 6 months ago. That was before Trump won a second trip to the White House. So an interesting question to ask, I think, is will this constitutional critique from those in the academic media sphere, will that continue? And I ask that question because I think many of these folks aren't grounded in democratic Republican values. They have a constitutional critique. They're not grounded in these democratic Republican values. So will that continue after Trump's election? I don't know. Maybe. What is what I'm thinking about as well is that the constitutional bind, which is described by Aziz Rana, in which one thinks that the Constitution is both a problem and the solution. Aziz Rana calls that the bind. And also a devil you know attitude, which is something that Samuel Moyn over at Yale has talked about, in which one is essentially more content with something familiar, no matter how bad that thing is, that those two attitudes are very strong and they're very alluring. It's very tempting to seek safety in the Constitution and to seek out, to use a very hot term, the guardrails of the Constitution that will protect us. Then again, I don't know if that particular line of thinking will hold. The Supreme Court is less popular than at any point since polling began. While the Electoral College didn't give Trump the presidency this time, like it did in 2016, the Constitution also hasn't done anything to stop Trump returning. And then you often hear people saying things like, well, what guardrails do exist? Or, gosh, are there any guardrails left? Basically to say, what checks and balances, assuming that, you know, we're going to call the checks and balances good things. What checks and balances even do exist now that Trump is president and has all this power? So that's one sphere of critique. Along with that small but noticeable critique in academia and some sections of the media, there's also a slight but noticeable movement within the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA. DSA is like a big tent of many different left of center tendencies. And it is important to point out that this introduction of a constitutional critique in terms like democratic republicanism are mainly due to one group within DSA, Marxist Unity Group, or MUG. And I have my differences with MUG's position. I'm on record as saying that we should change our name to the Democratic Constitution Group. But it's impossible to trace the return of democratic Republican ideas to the US left without mentioning MUG. So I do like to mention MUG. Thanks to the hard work of many MUG members, Democratic Republican positions are actually now sprinkled across DSA. So, for example, DSA's program says that it's our goal to put workers in charge of the government through a new democratic constitution that establishes civil, political, and democratic rights for all, is based on proportional representation in a single federal legislature, and that ends the role of money in politics. A few DSA chapters also passed resolutions stating that the Constitution denies equality, denies self-determination, and that we need a new and radically democratic Constitution. And then I really like this bit from a resolution that YDSA, the Young Democratic Socialists of America, passed, and I'll quote a paragraph or so from it. That resolution calls on DSA to openly indict the Constitution as an anti-democratic, as anti-democratic and oppressive. YDSA encourages all DSA members in office to do the same, right? Everyone to take up that critique, to take concrete actions to advance the struggle for a democratic republic by agitating against undemocratic judicial review, fighting for proportional representation, delegitimizing the anti-democratic US Senate, so on and so forth. And then YDSA concludes by saying, as youth of the Democratic Socialist Movement, we declare that to be a socialist is to fight for an expansive working class democracy. And in the context of the US, this means demanding a new constitution. So I will say that right now, DSA's statements are more or less words on paper. There's really minimal, if any, direction in DSA. At the same time, the Democratic Constitution blog, the blog that I and another MUG and DSA member, Lucas DeHart, are involved in, that blog, while attracting many people who want to talk about the need for a new constitution, we have anything but a critical mass of supporters behind us. But I do think that new words and publications are indicative of new ideas, right? So things are small, but I want to focus on what's changing. This kind of language, right? Not just critiquing the Constitution, but also demanding a new and a democratic one, really hasn't been seen within the U.S. socialist movement since the Socialist Party of America. And that was at a time when Eugene Debs, very famous socialist, was publishing articles like one titled "Why We Have Outgrown the U.S. Constitution." Victor Berger, who I mentioned before, as a House member, was actually trying to pass bills through the House, stating that the Senate was obstructive, useless, a menace to the liberties of the people, an obstacle to social growth. Those were all quotes from Victor Berger. Charles Beard, not himself in the Socialist Party of America, on the left, but in general a very respected historian then and now, wrote his book, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the U.S., which argued that the framers were actually motivated by economic interests. So all that to say, this type of language that we're seeing hasn't been seen since a period when there was a flourishing, if you will, of constitutional critique. So I'm starting to wind down a little bit here, but as I do, I want to talk about the Democratic Party and then also make a few points about, well, what will Trump's election do to this? What could Trump's election do? So will Trump's election help spread Democratic Republican ideology within the DSA? That's understandably one of the many questions. What will Trump's election do? If it does, right, if Trump being president does help spread the ideas that I've been talking about, I think it will only be because of people who really want to make it happen within the organization. Folks putting forward really clear and consistent messaging. I don't think that this Democratic Republican ideology is going to develop spontaneously within the socialist movement or within larger society. Until that point, assuming we can reach that point, until that point, I think we're going to see a lot of vague slogans and really no clear political direction. So, for example, for what it's worth, the day after the election, I got an email from DSA saying that regardless of the election results, our task is to organize, to become a bigger and more skilled socialist movement, to contest for power, and to win big for the working class. It's kind of my reaction. It's kind of a shrug. And I dream of a time, this is my dream, I dream of a time in which that paragraph reads, regardless of the election results, our task is to win a democratic republic. Something specific, something strategic that we can really latch onto here. And then, of course, there's the Democratic Party, which is obviously the party with democracy in its name. The Democrats, as I think it was important to note up until Trump's victory and also now after Trump's victory, the Democrats spent the entire campaign posing as defenders of the Constitution and therefore of democracy. You can find various quotes to back this up. Kamala Harris, for example, admonished Americans to really understand what it would mean if Donald Trump were back in the White House with no guardrails. There again is that invocation of the term guardrails. She really put forward this idea, I'll call it a myth, that political power lies in the hands of ordinary Americans, saying that it's up to the American people to stop him. I liked to hear that quote and then say, well, you know, he didn't win the popular vote in 2016. So I don't know what else, you're wanting folks to do. But basically to say, how? where is this sort of political power that the Constitution gives the American people to realize their political desires? And then Joe Biden said that not since President Lincoln and the Civil War have freedom and democracy been under assault at home as they have been today. And Biden also said that if Democrats don't own the presidency, then we're going to find ourselves in the position where democracy is literally at stake. So democracy and the Constitution were really what the Democratic Party were trying to drive home, among other things. In fact, right, the Democrats rely on the undemocratic Senate and other undemocratic features of our political system just as much as the Republicans to fund their wars and to block progressive legislation. And I think a vital part of the Democratic Republican project will involve taking back the meaning of democracy and severing its ideological link to the Constitution. The question of how to build a socialist party independent of the Democrats is evergreen. And here I'll say that trying to push them left hasn't worked, nor I think really has calling the Democratic Party capitalists who hate socialism. And so I think Trump's victory represents an opportunity, still only an opportunity, to argue that democratic republicanism and the demand for a democratic constitution is what separates us from the mainstream of the Democratic Party. We can point out that the Democrats call themselves Democrats, small d Democrats. Well, they aren't attacking the Supreme Court. They aren't talking about the malapportioned Senate, even when the Republicans are in the majority. I don't expect them to now. Why should we we should keep pointing at the undemocratic Constitution and call out any of the Democrats who fail us. So I'll start winding down here, and this is where I get to the second part of the prompt, and where I'm actually, I think, going to rely on a little bit of the audience to help me answer this question. But what does this mean for England and the rest of the United Kingdom? And the long and the short answer is that I don't know. And I have this thought, which is that in some ways, you all, of course, can tell me, but in some ways, Democratic Republicans might have an easier job in the US than you all in the UK, in the sense that our system is so unglaringly undemocratic. I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but every aspect of our Constitution, let alone the entire document, is just so patently absurd from dozens of angles. Of course, the connection is that a mighty struggle for a democratic republic in the U.S., let alone the movement's success, would have reverberations that would be felt in the UK. I'm sure just as much as the reverberations caused by a mighty struggle from you all would be felt in our country. We are, of course, connected in those ways. I will say, as a little aside, um, I think it's important to note how ideas are very important. And I want to give an example of how ideas spread and the power that ideas can have when they're seized upon by really curious and dedicated people. So I said earlier that Mugg deserves some credit for at least putting the word Democratic Republic back into the left's vocabulary. I know for sure that Mugg started to care about the Constitution because of the, I, this I know for sure. I know for sure I started to care about the Constitution and these ideas of republicanism because of what I learned in Mugg and the people who I met in Mugg. I'm also fairly confident that Marxist Unity Group got its democratic republican language from Mike McNair and the Communist Party of Great Britain Provisional Central Committee. And I'm relatively confident that the CPGB got their democratic republicanism through Steve Freeman and you all in the Republican labor camp. So again, folks can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is important to point out how these ideas that we're talking about spread and will continue to spread as powerful ideas do. So my last two paragraphs here, I'll wrap up. Some people in the DSA are wondering about a boost in membership numbers similar to what happened in 2016. That feels like a really long time ago. But 2016 transformed DSA in many ways. We grew a lot. Part of that had to do with Trump's victory. Not all of it, but part of it. I want to caution, though, that I think right now numbers aren't the pressing issue. That we really need to focus on ideology and strategy. And I think DSA will, and other leftist groups too in the US, will be under a lot of pressure to try and run around and stop everything that Trump is saying that he will do or whatever is going to come down the pipe, instead of moving forward with a very positive, precise program. So I think there will be pressure not to do that, to really run around. And it'll be hard to create that positive, precise program that we have. And then, of course, I think we should infuse that program with a core of democratic republicanism and a demand for that democratic constitution. So I'll wrap up by saying that the Democratic Republican strategy, it would have been the same if Harris had won. I wrote maybe about 3/4 of this, to be honest, before I knew the results of the election. And folks can tell me if they think that was the wrong result. But that's just to say that to say exactly that point, this strategy would have been the same regardless of who won, right? Maybe a Trump administration will provide a few more openings for Democratic agitation, but it certainly won't do the hard work for us, really that work of developing political consciousness and winning people to our ideas. So in this period where things are in flux, a lot of things are unknown, I think we as Democratic Republicans can be really confident in our strategy and really keeping on centering that demand for democracy. Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you for letting me present to you all.
Thank you very much indeed, Luke. That was very educational in explaining exactly what goes on with the American Constitution, and quite depressing, I think. Really, it seems to be, as you said, it seems to be set up to prevent any kind of democracy at all. But thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to throw the meeting open to anybody who would like to ask a question or make a contribution. And I see Mike's hand is up already, so I'm going to bring Mike in now.
Luke, thank you. That was incredible. I learned a great deal there, actually, as I suspect we all did. I just one quick question to kick things off. Is it the case, or how much is it the case, that the Senate's right of filibuster and also the Electoral College are really the legacies of a somewhat unresolved resolution? Unresolved resolution. Sorry, that's a I'm two words that fight against each other, but an irresolution then of the American Civil War, and that really some of the blocks that exist may not, frankly, be removed so that the current sort of frozen two-party kind of charade that we see reenacted every 4 years, with no scope for anything more radical. That can only start to be removed once there is an addressing of these unresolved matters left over from the Civil War. I mean, we have, the extreme racism that exists. I mean, clearly it's not just in America, but there are elements there that really I cannot see any way other than to try and work through some of those. And dare I say that might mean a second civil war. I mean, what do you think?
Luke, would you like to answer that right now?
I'll take a few more questions, I think. I've noted the questions, and I'll try and wrap them all in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I come in with a couple of questions? I'm still waiting for more hands to go up. I think everyone's found your talk very educational, and they're actually mulling it over and thinking about it. I'd like to know, John Tooman has now put up his hand, but I'd like to know, they had 4 years, the Democrats, to do something about Trump not getting back in, apart from using the illegal solution. Why didn't they do anything? Why didn't they, for instance, take more action over Roe v. Wade? Why haven't they done anything about the Electoral College and changing the fact that various states, no matter how many people they have in them, have the same number of senators, which seems absolutely ridiculous. Surely it should be based on the number of people in those states. So am I being unrealistic here? Would the Democrats have been able to do that in the 4 years that they've had since Trump was last in, and therefore have some chance of him not getting in again? Anyway, I'm going to bring John and then Ken in. John Tillman.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was I listened to another Zoom call on Friday, about this with three American socialists discussing and debating between one another, which was very interesting. And some of the things that came up was the extent was that the turnout was something like 10 million down on previous elections, and that there had been a decline in the turnout over the last few presidential elections. So that's my first question. Secondly, that there had been a 20% swing amongst young people to Trump. And thirdly, that Trump had actually made inroads amongst Latino communities, Black communities, white working class communities, as well as women, but particularly amongst young males, there was a trend which at least one of those speakers believed had happened. With regard to the turnout, that would seem to support the kind of thing that you and Mug are trying to do within the DSA, which is very important. That as over here there is a democratic deficit, and that the people at large are actually aware of that democratic deficit and are angry about it and disillusioned to the extent that over here too, the turnout at each general election has gone down and down and down. And now at local elections, well, it has been for some time, local elections, they can be won on 20% of the vote of those eligible to vote. So those are my three questions.
Thank you very much indeed, John. I'm going to bring Ken Syme in now.
Thanks, Carol, and thank you, Luke. I mean, you speak, Luke, quite correctly of the democratic deficit in the US system. However, the Americans are certainly represented as believing they have one of the most democratic governments on earth. How far is it possible to convince people to lobby for something they believe they already have? If people are dissatisfied with democracy, is it because they think it doesn't function the way it was designed to? Do they actually comprehend that it was designed almost to function in the way that it does? And how do you bridge that gap between the perception that they already have one of the most democratic systems on earth and the reality of what they have been bequeathed by the founding fathers? I'd be interested to see how you would look to bridge that gap. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Over to you, Luke, to answer those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So starting with the question of the legacy of the Civil War, yes, I mean, so much of U.S. history, and I think of what we're dealing with, is wrapped up in questions of slavery, the legacy of slavery, the war that ended slavery, the period after that. So first, just understanding the Constitution as a product of a period in which the United States was a slave state, and how there was a concern that if there wasn't representation for the interests of these slave states, they might lose their slaves. And so a lot of these minority checks that we see still represented in our Constitution, I think, do come from something of a compromise, if you will, between the states trying to create a unified whole. In fact, the decision that created that two senators per state rule, if I'm not wrong, is called the Connecticut Compromise. So it's referred to as a compromise because there were people involved in the creation of the Constitution who realized that this very clearly did violate the principle of equal voting rights. But seeing the Constitution in that context, and then thinking about the Civil War and Reconstruction, and I think looking at those periods through the lens of the Constitution is important to do, to see how was the Constitution able to bend, if you will, but not break, what elements changed, but what elements stayed the same, what were some of the radical Republicans during Reconstruction, Reconstruction being the period after the Civil War. What were some of the radical Republicans during that period saying about the Constitution and how it hampered their activities, what they could do, what they couldn't do, so on and so forth. It opens up so much territory to really think. The question about what the Republicans, or excuse me, what the Democrats were and weren't doing during these 4 years. One thing that comes to mind in regards to the question around the Senate and changing the Senate representation, that's an example of something that would take a constitutional amendment, but it's even deeper than that in regards to the Senate, because Article 5 actually says that you can't change any of the Senate stuff without getting all the states to agree to it. So you would actually need the states that would lose out in that change to agree to it as well. So I'm sure folks will have better responses to this than I do, but one way to think about it is just you start to, even if you want, we'll give the Democrats the benefit of the doubt that they actually want to resolve these issues, which I don't really think they do. But even if they want to, once you kind of start picking at one aspect of this kind of undemocratic mess, I think you start to pull on a thread that causes the whole thing to sort of unravel, if you will, which I don't think they're interested in doing. In terms of, folks here thinking they have a democratic system and what people think democracy means, I think it connects a little bit to the question of turnout, which is to say that I think there are a lot of people who are very dissatisfied. And if there was a period in US history when something called democracy was a real kind of definable thing that we had and was given to us by our Constitution and that made us great, especially compared to the communists and the Nazis, the big villains outside. I think that period has passed. And while there isn't real cohesion or real clarity about what's going on, I think there is widespread discontent. And so how to work with that? Well, I think one way is just to point out the roadblocks that exist to what people want, and to point out the disparity between the desire people have and what this system allows, and then to point out how the system is structured in such a way to deny that. In terms of where Trump won, where he didn't, turnout being low, still the vast number of people who didn't vote. Michael Roberts, the economist, on his blog has an article on the elections that has a lot of stats that maybe folks can look to as well for that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I've got 3 more hands up. Gil, I'm going to you first.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I've got opinions on all this stuff. About Mike's question about the Civil War, I don't think it's a legacy of the Civil War or of the South. The South was crushed. The Northern military could have done whatever it wanted. The problem was the political attitudes in the North. The radical Republicans wanted a democratic constitution, and they were defeated. Okay, so whatever legacy of racism or whatever was left over, the power to determine that was not in the South, it was in the North. And the North reinstituted Southern power in Congress to block any progressive policies for the next 100 years. Okay. So the question of where to focus on this stuff is entirely in the northern capitalist power centers, and they use the Constitution to block everything. Carol mentioned the Putney debates. In my mind, this struggle has been going on for 400 years. The principle of one person, one vote. It's consistent through the American and French revolutions, through the entire Marxist movement. The 20th century obviously threw history for a loop. Okay, Nazis, Stalin, the Cold War. That's the legacy we're dealing with. The Democrats, why they didn't do anything for 4 years. The purpose of the Democrats in the last 4 years was to crush the Bernie Sanders movement. They strung him out for 2 years. He was the head of the budget committee. And then Joe Manchin and the head of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, is stuck the knife in the back. Okay. And it completely destroyed the progressive promise. Okay, but that was its purpose. There should be no illusion that the Democratic Party has any interest in changing the Constitution or pursuing, progressive policies. And on the election, the big story is the drop in turnout. Trump's absolute numbers have hardly budged. It was essentially a boycott against by Democratic voters of the Democratic Party. They were so disgusted that Biden was supposed to be a one-term president, so that whole story is just hopeless, and people just didn't want anything to do with it. And as for Americans believing they have a democracy, they do not believe they have a democracy. The majority of people in this country do not like the Electoral College. They think should be a popular vote for president. They don't like the Supreme Court. They know it's an unrepresentative institution. So again, these are problems on the left where, they go off on, wild goose chases of what's the problem. And there's only one problem, and we just don't have a democracy. Now, the practical problem of how you deal with it, well, again, we can look at history. What does it take to win democracy anywhere? Who's done it? Europe only has democracy because of the Russian and American armies overthrowing the Nazis, defeating the Nazis. So we're in a very strange world. As Luke said, DSA doesn't really want to deal with the Constitution, doesn't want to deal that we don't have a democracy, that they want to, elect progressive Democrats. And yet time and time again, they get slapped down. Anyway, so those are my opinions on all this stuff. And there's potential, because the structure of the Constitution is so undemocratic. There's no other path for the left here. So in that sense, I'm optimistic. Sorry for talking so long.
No, thank you very much, Gil. Really good points, well made. But again, very depressing. I've got Minnie and then Steve and then Russell. Minnie and Graham.
Hi, thanks for that, Luke. I learned a lot from that. The power of veto, how totally undemocratic the US is. And just to Gil's point there, I don't think we've got democracy in Europe. It's dim, it's mock, and it's crassy. It doesn't exist. So, we vote every few years, like in the US. We've got no power of recall. We have the parliamentary constituency, where only a few votes in this country matter, just like in the States in that setup. The court can be made to do what they want, really, what the establishment wants. Look at Julian Assange, etc., etc. We've got 4 nations and England rules, and we've got the financial centre of London within England ruling. So I would make the point that neoliberal capitalism, or capitalism, the state it's in, current state and all of its state, obviously disastrous. So I would say that we need an anti-capitalist party, international, obviously, in England, in USA, in Europe, they're all linked up. But would there be a move in the US to, what do you think, Luke, about the left coming up with a constitution, an anti-capitalist constitution that would, and then a mass party that puts that forward outside the Democratic Party? I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Minnie. I think you're asking questions that we're asking in the UK as well at the moment. I've got Steve. I've got 3 more hands up, Luke. Would you like to take all of those speakers and then come back?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, Steve.
Right. Thank you, Luke. That was really good and very informative. And I think that for us here in the UK, our attempt to get to grips with the Constitution always seems a bit mad on the left. So it's very good to hear there are parallels going on somewhere else, you know, in terms of the way politics is being approached, or the way you're trying to change politics, let's put it like this, on the left in America, which is obviously a massive task. I can see obvious parallels between the kind of thing you're doing with the Democratic Constitution blog and what we're trying to do here with the Republican Labour Education Forum. There are many parallels, so it's always worth taking notes. I think what we're talking about is having a constitutional revolution. And I like to attach the word revolution to constitution. It's not just constitutional reform. And I think the difference is a constitutional revolution says you need to scrap the revolution, the constitution you've got, and construct a new one with the people involved in the process. And that means you need a constituent assembly. I think that's a very important argument, that the people should reconstitute their state. And wherever there's been revolutions in the past, constituent assemblies emerge or arise, because people are saying the old regime, the old constitution just doesn't work. And the way you've explained the American Constitution, it's quite clear that it is simply a barrier to the development of working class politics. I mean, Marx talked about the federal aspect of the American Constitution, and he said the federal aspect of the American Constitution was, he thought, progressive, in the sense that it brought these different states together into one state, which he thought that was a step forward. But he said it was a barrier. It had become a barrier. It got in the way of the people really changing things. So he understood that the problem of federalism is also one of the problems, I think, that America has to look at as well in all of that. And again, when you make the parallel, where does our constitution come from? Here, you know, it comes earlier than yours. It comes when we had a republic in 1649. And then it comes from the constitutional monarchy, 1688 to 1707. And I think that constitutional monarchy is what you've got. I think that kind of went to America as well, except you could say that America is a constitutional monarchy with the kingly powers in the hands of the president and all the checks and balances, so that the president isn't a dictator. I think another parallel is that we have in the UK here an economic and social crisis and a crisis of our democracy. And we're getting a polarization all over the place between, I think, ultimately fascism or republicanism. I think that's the ultimate thing that we face. Trump is not a fascist, I don't think, but his radical populism MAGA, tax cuts, immigration, all those sorts of things, create the basis. I think right-wing populism creates a mass base for fascism. So I think Trump has already shown when he tried to overthrow the Constitution, he was in transition towards some kind of possible fascism in America, which was defeated. And it strikes me amazing when you hear the rhetoric of the Biden-Harris campaign talking about the dangers of fascism and the threat to the American Republic posed by Trump, because that was one of their selling cards. Now, Biden has invited Trump round for tea and biscuits in the White House. And you think, well, how's that working then? You think we're threatened with fascism and now it's tea and biscuits. So there's a massive gap between the reality and the kind of rhetoric of it. The final point is this: I think the means of changing the Constitution has to be through mass movements, has to be street movements, has to be building a party committed to getting rid of the Constitution and creating, as you said, a democratic republic. And I think that we can learn from you, and hopefully you can learn from us. And I think a really fruitful change, because there are so many parallels. But I think republicanism applies to many republics. You know, the last point is this: we're very conservative on the left in England. We don't really do republicanism in England. We do anti-monarchism very good. I mean, we absolutely, people hate the monarchy, they'd like to get rid of it, but that's about as far as it goes. They don't really think it through as a political constitution, the idea of a republic as having democracy and all the rights that go with it. Finish there.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm bringing in Russell and then Francis. Russell.
Thanks, Carol, and thanks, Luke. As the discussions proceeded, I'm reminded of a famous slogan from the 80s, and I think it may come from Ken Livingstone himself. And the slogan was, if democracy could change anything, they would ban it. And that takes me to, this morning, I was listening to a podcast by Professor Richard Wolff. He's an American Marxist economist. I'm not sure if you're acquainted with him, Luke, and his podcast is, he has I think it's a project called Democracy at Work. And now linked to a question that you raised, Luke, and something that Steve has just tried to address in this podcast, which was done, I think, just before the US presidential election. Richard Wolff makes the interesting observation of how the global crisis of capitalism linked to the declining power of the US empire is leading to an anti-democratic right-wing turn, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. In fact, he says that the US is, in a sense, learning from Europe because Europe is ahead of the United States. And he poses this question that Steve has posed. The US isn't fascist and Trump isn't fascist, but there's a potentiality. And he points to, I was particularly struck by his example of France, where the party that won, or rather the coalition that won the majority of votes in the French parliamentary election was the left. Yet President Macron refused to allow the left the opportunity of forming a government, and in fact invited people like what's her name, the extreme right wing leader.
Marie Le Pen.
Yeah, Marie Le Pen. In a sense, because of the global crisis in capitalism, the so-called centrists are willing to work with the extreme right, the potential fascists, in order to keep out the left. And he links that back to the history of fascism and how Nazism developed. So, yeah, those are interesting observations, and I wonder what you think about it. In fact, it seems the US is learning Europe's bad lessons.
Very interesting, Russell. I'm going to bring Francis in.
Thank you. I've done an enormous amount of theatre. Forum, have you heard of Forum Theatre? And a guy called Augusto Boal. Well, it's a highly political theatre form that came out of Brazil, where he had to flee from Brazil because of what he was doing. And it's a forum, it's a theatre form that brings power into the room, and it's played with by the people that you're working with. I went right through the labor movement, right through various local councils, working with the people who do the work. And what I saw there was what we could all talk about, which is the hegemonic assumptions, the hegemonic domination. And I think that the complexity is that revolutions take place. They tend to kind of collapse, but there is a slight success. So there is a sort of democracy in the UK. But of course, it all starts decaying once you win it, and you have to start all over again. And I do think that trying to simply remove and bring in a kind of left movement, I'd love one, I would love it. But that, I'm a member of the Labour Party and somewhat disgusted by it. Nevertheless, I sit there and I listen to the debate that goes on between the different sections. An overall view, as Marx whatever, is a really important way of looking at things. And when I was doing the theatre work with groups of workers from different industries and different councils, the notion of bringing together a focus on how the power is working, which of course is reflected step by step through all the organizations, so that when trade unions step forward, they fight that manifestation of hegemony with any luck, and people get understandings and positions on it. So I think that it would be great to have major socialist parties, preferably all over the world. But I do think we have to think about process, hegemony, development, growth, and understanding.
Thank you very much, Francis. Right, I'm going to go back to you now, Luke, to answer those questions.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Maybe I'll start with that point that was just made. Sort of a half-baked thought, but in terms of plays, there is a play. I don't know if it's still going on in the U.S. It's about the Constitution. It's actually called "What the Constitution Means to Me." I've been thinking of writing something about it. I haven't, but as I understand it, at the end of this play, the question is posed: how would you write the Constitution, or what would you change, or what would you keep? Kind of opening up that question to people. So I like to think that people have been and will continue to be brought into this question of struggling for democracy in various ways. And I think one way of doing that is to pose some of these questions around what would it mean to have a say that folks never got? What would you do with this democracy if you had it? How would it be realized? So on and so forth. And questions also about how people learn things are also important. I don't think it's the case that folks will necessarily, I'll say it like this. An important part, I think, of doing political agitation is to be responding to the things that are happening and putting forward that Democratic, Republican, lens, if you will, through various events that happen. Being there to critique, expose, describe things through that lens, I think is very important. So that's I appreciate that comment about how people learn. In terms of France and Europe, oh gosh, I'm not. I don't know enough about France and Europe. I did write something when elections were taking place in France after a friend pointed this out to me, which is to say that Trotsky at one point in time in the 30s did kind of revive the Democratic Republican critique and the Democratic Republican demands found in the 1903 Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and did revive them in a demand for France at the time. So I thought it was just at least worth mentioning that I think in many ways France is still struggling for the type of democratic Republican state that I outlined here, that Trotsky outlined. That's a whole talk in and of itself, the discussions around this within the socialist movement. But to say that wherever you're looking at struggles for democracy, I think if you have a particular definition of what that democracy would be, I think you can find it lacking in a lot of places, including in France. In regards to Richard Wolff and people talking about democracy, the economy, so on and so forth, what comes to mind, and this is more just about Richard Wolff, is that I think there's the potential to bring lots of people into a democratic movement, right? Richard Wolff has a podcast. I don't remember if the title was around democracy. He certainly uses the word democracy. Amy Goodman has her podcast, Democracy Now! I was talking recently about this guy, oh shoot, I'm blanking on his name, but it's kind of in vogue these days in the academy in the US, at least, to talk about republicanism through the lens of domination and being unfree and dominated and so on and so forth. There are all these potentials to bring those discussions together. And I think what so many of them miss is a discussion of the Constitution. If you're going to talk about democracy in the context of the US, in my mind, you need to be saying something about the Constitution. If you're going to be saying something about domination, unfreedom, democracy now, so on and so forth, you need to be saying something about the Constitution. If democracy could change anything, they would ban it. That just made me think of the title of a book that I saw recently, by a lawyer. He's a labor lawyer in Chicago. He wrote an article in a American outlet in the early 90s called The Infernal Senate, which was one of the very early, perhaps almost a little too early, if you will, critiques of the Constitution and the Senate in this kind of new wave, if you will. Too early in the sense of only, very few people were talking about this stuff in the 90s. But his book, which came out in 2020, is called The History of Democracy Has Yet to Be Written. And I really like that title. Just as I like this phrase, if democracy could change anything, they would ban it, in the sense of I don't think that we have anything yet to ban in that sense. In the sense of we're still struggling for something that is not there yet, but that we need to get. In terms of a constitutional revolution and how to get this new constitution, what comes to mind is what Daniel Lazaire said in a recent article for the Democratic Constitution blog, which is just to say that there are no constitutional solutions to the problems we're facing. And he said that in the context of the unusability of Article 5. And I think that's a very clear way to say it. There aren't constitutional solutions to what we're talking about. There's no constitutional way to get this democracy that we're talking about, in the sense of the existing constitution can't be used to bring that about. And then it does bring up things like constituent assemblies, which Dan in particular has written a fair bit about. And then in regards to the left and the left coming up with a constitution and forming a mass party that would put forward the demand for a constitution outside the Democratic Party. It's a struggle. And as I said, I think it's happening bit by bit to get the left to talk about the Constitution. Someone said to me recently, Luke, I don't really understand what you're talking about. The left has always been interested in democracy. The left has always been concerned about democracy in the US. Okay, even if we take that as good coin, maybe we will. It's just not the case that the left has been talking about the political structures in the US, primarily the Constitution, and how that denies democracy. If you're talking about democracy again and not talking about the Constitution, you're missing something big. So I think one change that could happen in regards to the left and democracy is seeing things like workers' power as democracy, and seeing phrases like a workers' democracy or a workers' constitution as redundant, if you will, in the sense of being, well, democracy would be workers' power. To have a democracy would give us that power to do these things. So part of this struggle is history, part of this struggle is language, part of this struggle is bringing in Lenin and Marx, so on and so forth. But I think it's happening slowly but surely. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Luke. Gil's got his hand up again. Gil, I'll bring you in for a second bite of the cherry, as it were.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to respond to, Russell's comment about Europe is leading the way politically and that the US is learning from Europe. Now, I think that's the wrong framework. We can just go back to the fall of the Soviet Union and then the expansion of NATO eastward. The great financial crisis, its center was the United States. The war with Ukraine, the blowing up of the gas pipeline. Europe is very much a protectorate of the United States. The United States is a military empire, a military and economic empire. Okay? Now, we're in the United States. And so there's an intimate connection between our political system and the operations of the US empire. Now, in all of this, the United States is the leader, and Europe and Britain are really subordinate players in this. So there was also a question of we need an international movement. Well, of course we need an international movement. But what kind of movement, and what is it focused on? Okay, well, it's not just capitalism. I mean, that's way too general. The United States is the primary purveyor of violence in the world. It's been overthrowing governments throughout the Middle East for at least the last 20 years. It caused the immigrant crisis in Europe and all the consequences of that. there's this argument that the left makes that the U.S. has to show solidarity with movements around the world. In some sense, movements around the world and people in Europe have to show solidarity with us. This is the center of the empire, and again, like I emphasized, the undemocratic nature of our electoral system is so extreme. It is much more extreme than the UK. It's much more extreme than France. France and the UK would love to have the Nordic systems. I mean, when Macron pulls his bullshit, you can't get away with that kind of maneuver when you actually have universal and equal suffrage in one body. Okay, the Nordics don't have presidents. Okay, the left can't overlook these political structures. They're really important. It's where political conflict happens. Anyway, so I just want to emphasize, we are the center of the empire, and who knows where this is going vis-a-vis China. I don't think we've only seen little bits of the potential with what's going on in Ukraine, or even in the Middle East. And so I think we got to raise our sights. Imperialism, war. Yes, the crisis is causing a rightward shift. I mean, that's true. Okay, but we have to combat it. And I'm totally with Steve on this. It's fascism versus democratic republicanism. That's the conflict in the world. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Gil. And I'm bringing Russell back in. And we are running a little bit over time. We try not to do more than 90 minutes, but I'll bring Russell back in. Russell.
Yeah, I just quickly wanted to respond to Gil. Perhaps I wasn't very clear. I mean, anyone who knows me on this side of the pond would know all too well that I consider the empire to be US-led Western imperialism. So I completely agree with you on that. But what I was saying, I was actually citing Richard Wolff. Richard was basically using the example of, so he compared the Democratic Party of the US to the Social Democratic parties of Europe, centrist, or what you would call positionally center-left political organizations. And he was demonstrating in his podcast how these social democratic movements, certainly within the current conjuncture, are shedding their social welfare policies one by one. So even though the Labour Party in the UK won the general election, its social welfare policies are much the same as the Tory policy. So for instance, in some cases, some might argue even worse. So they have shed the winter fuel allowance for pensioners, hitting many poor pensioners. They won't change the Tory policy on the cap, what's called the two child working credit cap. So if you have more than 2 children, you can't get welfare for successive children. And he was basically saying that this would be very much the case if the Democrats had won. There wouldn't be any increases in social welfare. In fact, there would probably be a diminution of social welfare because of the crisis in capitalism. So in a sense, that's all I was saying. They learning quickly from Europe how to try and win elections, conning people that they're centrist and they believe in social welfare, etc., while in fact they're cutting social welfare. And of course, the example of Macron teaming up with the extreme right to keep the left out. And yeah, so that's all I was saying. But I agree with you on the substantive points about who's the leader of the pack.
Thank you very much, Russell and Gil. I've got Steve's hand up. So Steve,
I'll make it,
I can
yes.
ask you to be very...
I'll be very brief. I just wanted to, I was just reminded of something, just to emphasize how difficult what we're trying to do is. And I was reminded of a quote that I read from Tony Benn, and he was quoting Machiavelli in 1513. And Machiavelli says this: "It should be borne in mind that there is nothing more difficult to handle, more doubtful of success, and more dangerous to carry through than initiating changes in a state's constitution. The innovator makes enemies of all those who have prospered under the old order, and only lukewarm support is coming from those who would prosper under the new." To put it another way, the ruling class will fight tooth and nail to defend their constitution because they realize that all their privileges depend upon it. But on the other hand, as it were, our side's not that sure whether it means anything, will bring anything, will be anything. So our side starts out lukewarm, and we're coming up against an enemy who's absolutely committed to maintaining the existing constitution against all opponents, which reminds us that what you're trying to do in America, what we're trying to do here is a really difficult task, as Machiavelli pointed out in the 16th century. Okay.
Thank you very much, Steve. Point well taken. Absolutely true. There's nothing new under the sun, is there?
Absolutely not.
So I don't see any further hands up, Luke. So I'm going to give the floor to you again, just to give your concluding remarks.
Sure. Well, thank you, Carol, and thank you so much for having me on. I think it goes without saying that it's really nice to talk about these ideas with other people and to have spaces where these ideas can be talked about. You know, I guess one thing I've been thinking, listening to these comments, is that they're so the world is so vast and full of so many different angles and histories and subjects and themes and so on and so forth. And that is forever how the world will be. That's how it is, the vastness and the complexity of everything. And something I find very helpful is to really hone in on, you know, what one feels like is the key link or the lodestone that you know, holds up the rest of the arch, or the door that kind of holds back the flood, so to speak, and to really hone in on that and really focus in on that and make that your point of critique. And I think in the US and in other places as well, that point of critique is democracy, and particularly for us in the US, that Constitution that we have, and how we can struggle to make the US actually a democracy. So just emphasizing the utility of kind of grabbing onto something that one feels like is a link, holding on to it, and really focusing on that. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Luke. This has been an incredible meeting. It's been so educational. Unfortunately, it's really quite depressing as well. It seems we have a mountain in front of us to get to democracy in the US. and to democracy anywhere else. But if it could happen in the US, and I think there would be so much hope for everywhere else. So thank you very much indeed, Luke, for joining us today and giving us so much of your time. And everybody else that's attended and has asked questions and made contributions, they've been absolutely amazing. Some of the contributions have also been excellent. So thank you to everybody and enjoy the rest of your evening.